Listen, I've always known that Fleetwood Mac has had a lot going on between the complicated relationships, the drug addiction, and constant changes within the band, but I was not ready for the wild ride that this was when looking into it. This could have easily been multiple videos and several hours long, but I wanted to try and condense it as much as I could. So go ahead and grab a drink, settle in, we're about to get into it. So our story begins with a gentleman by the name of Peter Green, and Peter was in a band that was from London, England called John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. The band consisted of John Mayall, Peter Green, John McVie, and Ainsley Dunbar. And fun fact, Eric Clapton was in the band for a short period of time, and it was due to Eric's leaving that Peter ended up joining the band. Peter had worked with somebody named Mick Fleetwood before and had suggested to John that they replace their drummer with Mick because he liked him so much, and John ended up agreeing and let him into the band. Things seemed to be going pretty well for a while, and Peter was actually gifted free recording time and had decided to record a couple of songs with Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. One of the songs that they ended up recording, they named Fleetwood Mac, which was just a combination of Mick and John's last names. And from what I read, it didn't seem like John Mayall was included in this, so I'm not quite sure where he was in all of this process, but apparently he wasn't there. It was soon after this that Peter had suggested to Mick that they create their own band and wanted John to join as their bassist. They had even named the band after the song that they created, Fleetwood Mac, to try and convince John to join them. But it seemed like John wasn't really convinced at this point and decided that he wanted to stay with John Mayall because it was a consistent paycheck for him. So instead they brought on Jeremy Spencer as guitarist and Bob Brunning as their bassist. After a few weeks and seeing them perform, John McVie did decide to leave the Blues Breaker and join their band. They went on to release their first album, which was self-titled, in February of 1968, and it went on to be number 4 in the UK. They then released their second album, called Mr. Wonderful, a few months later in August of that same year. Shortly after Mr. Wonderful's release, they added another guitarist by the name of Danny Kerwin. So now the band consisted of Danny, Peter, John, Mick, and Bob. In November of 1968, they released the song Albatross, which was their first #1 hit song. It was at this point that the band was really starting to take off and gain popularity, even getting multiple offers from record labels, including the Beatles' Apple Records, although I'm curious if that's because George Harrison was the brother-in-law to Mick Fleetwood, so maybe there's a little bit of a connection there. They ended up signing on with Warner Brothers under Reprise Records and released their third album, Then Play On, in 1969. During their European tour, it was said that Peter was experimenting a lot with LSD and had a really bad trip with it one night and really wasn't ever the same after that. He went through a huge mental health crisis and was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and went through extensive treatment in order to get his mental health in order. Which honestly, good for him for taking the steps needed to make sure that he got the help that he needed. It was in April of 1970 that Peter decided to leave the band. Then September of that same year, they released their album Kiln House. John McVie's wife, Christine, was previously in a band called Chicken Shack, and they ended up inviting her to join Fleetwood Mac as their keyboardist, and it was a pretty smooth transition because she had already been there through most of their practices and knew the songs already. Then in February of 1971, another strange event within the band occurred when Jeremy said that he was going to go for a short walk and ended up not returning. They had no idea where he went. Everyone had searched for him for several days and ended up finding him and discovered that he left the band in order to join the religious cult Children of God. They had tried to convince him to come back, but he said he was really happy where he was and had no intention of returning. So they held auditions for a new guitarist and brought on Bob Welsh. Then in September of 1971, they released Future Games, which had a little bit more of a rock sound rather than their blues that they were mostly known for. A few months later, in 1972, they released Bare Trees. And of course, things just couldn't stay quiet and normal for Fleetwood Mac because it was then that Danny started to have a bit of a drinking problem and was becoming a bit violent and had broken some equipment one night before one of their performances. And of course, they could not keep him in the band and eventually kicked him out. So then they brought on Bob Weston and Dave Walker as guitarist and singer. Are we keeping track so far? That makes the members John McVie, Christine McVie, Mick Fleetwood, Bob Weston, Dave Walker, and Bob Welsh, right? Yes, yeah. And it was this lineup that released the album Penguin in 1973. If you thought the band was going to stay like this for very long, you would be wrong, because Dave Walker ended up getting fired due to his style not meshing well with the rest of the band. And it was shortly after, without Dave Walker, that they released the album Mystery to Me. 2 weeks into the tour, it was discovered that Mick's wife, Jenny Boyd, was having an affair with Bob Weston, which resulted in the cancellation of the tour, the firing of Bob, and the band splitting up. This left the band's manager, Cliff Davis, to pick up the pieces and to try and figure out what to do moving forward, because the band still had all of these obligations in the rest of their tour that they were supposed to be doing. So Cliff is looking around going, okay, I have this tour that we're supposed to still be going on, all of these dates that they're supposed to be performing, and I have no band to do this. So then he ended up having a bit of a light bulb moment where he said, well, I can still use the name Fleetwood Mac and maybe use these other musicians that I know of and just pass them off as Fleetwood Mac, and maybe nobody would notice. So his plan was to have a fake Fleetwood Mac pass off as the real Fleetwood Mac and perform the rest of the tour. So that's exactly what he did, which sounds kind of insane if you think about it, but he was actually kind of successful with this for a little bit of time. But then people did kind of slowly start to realize, okay, this is not Fleetwood Mac. These are not the people we came to see. And then they were absolutely furious and the rest of the tour got canceled. I feel like this alone would make a great plot for a movie, and maybe that exists somewhere. So if a movie like that does exist, please let me know, because I would love to watch that. After the real members of Fleetwood Mac discovered that Cliff had tried to pass off other people as the band, they ended up having a legal battle over who actually owns the rights to the name. And Mick and John felt that they have the rights because it's literally their names. It took a whopping 4 years before a settlement was reached. In the meantime, Bob Welsh ended up moving over to Los Angeles and convinced the rest of the band to move over there with him. So they ditched Cliff as their manager and headed to Hollywood. And in September of 1974, they signed a new contract with Warner Brothers and released their album, Heroes Are Hard to Find. One day, Mick was visiting Sound City Studios, and an employee there had played a song for him by the band Buckingham Nicks, and Mick liked the song so much that he wanted to invite the guitarist Lindsey Buckingham into Fleetwood Mac. Lindsey said he would only join Fleetwood Mac on the condition that he could also bring his girlfriend Stevie Nicks with him, and if that's not a loyal partner, I don't know what is. And this is the band as most people know it, which is John McVie, Christine McVie, Mick Fleetwood, Stevie Nicks, and Lindsey Buckingham. Then in 1975, they released their second self-titled album, which reached #1 within the US, sold over 500,000 copies in the first year, and had several hit songs like Rhiannon and Landslide. Then drama was starting to bubble up again within the band, and by 1976, John and Christine decided they were going to file for divorce. Meanwhile, Stevie and Mick were having an affair, even though he had recently remarried Jenny Boyd after that whole situation had happened. What's absolutely insane and honestly incredibly impressive is that all of this stress and turmoil got channeled into creating one of the best-selling albums of all time. And in February of 1977, the album Rumors was released, which featured several songs that they had written about other bandmates and their relationship issues. Lindsey had written Go Your Own Way, which was about him and Stevie. Stevie had written Dreams, which was about the two of them as well. Christine had written You Make Loving Fun, which was about somebody she was having a relationship with that was not John. I feel bad for liking the songs as much as I do, but I think we can all collectively thank them for their suffering that they went through to create such beautiful music. I hope that they felt like it was all worth it, because the album did go on to win a Grammy in 1978. They sold over 40 million copies worldwide and is the 8th best-selling album in world history. They released their next album, Tusk, in 1979, which didn't do quite as well and actually did have some criticism to it. It was during the recording of this album that Mick had started to fall in love with Stevie's friend Sarah and ended up ending their relationship to go be with her. Trying to replicate the success that Rumors had, they did end up recording and releasing the album Mirage, but then shortly after they decided to all go on a hiatus so that they could pursue their solo careers. They didn't want to end the band with Mirage being their last album, so they did get back together and release the album Tango in the Night, which did really well. It ended up being #1 in the UK. A tour was scheduled to support this album, but Lindsey didn't want to go on tour with the band, so they ended up having a meeting to where they would try and convince him to do so, but literally a fight broke out between him and Stevie, so Lindsey ended up leaving the band the next day. Instead, they brought on guitarist Rick Vito and Billy Burnett to take his place. They then released their greatest hits album in 1988, which they dedicated to Lindsey. In 1990, they did release the album Behind the Mask, which received some criticism because of Lindsay's absence, but according to Rolling Stones, they felt that Rick Vito and Billy Burnett's addition was one of the best things that ever happened to the band. The tour for Behind the Mask ended up with sold-out shows, and they even had Lindsay come up on stage and perform with them on their very last show. Stevie and Christy said that that tour was going to be their last with Fleetwood Mac, and they ended up leaving the band as well. Well, Christine did come back to record the album Time in 1995 with John, Mick, and Billy. After that album, throughout the years, their songs did end up making a resurgence several times within pop culture, even being used for presidential elections, TV shows, movies, and social media. This did result in the band getting back together to do performances here and there, but usually there was long stretches of time in between those performances. In 2003, they released the album Say You Will without Christine being there and went on their Unleashed tour without her. Then 10 years later, in 2013, they released their album Extended Play. They were even going to go on tour together for this album, but it was that October that John was diagnosed with cancer, and they had to cancel the tour because he needed to go seek treatment. This seemed to have struck a nerve with Christine because she voiced interest in joining the band again to do one last North American tour with them. Then in October of 2018, Lindsay filed a lawsuit against the band due to their touring schedule, but they did reach a settlement that he was happy with. Several of the original band members have passed away, including Bob Weston, Bob Brunning, Bob Welsh, and Danny Kerwin. It was Christine's passing in 2022 that seemed to really solidify the end of Fleetwood Mac and really making it seem unlikely that they would ever get back together again. Mick had even said himself that a line was drawn in the sand with the passing of Christine, and Stevie said that she saw no reason to continue with the band without her. With all of the craziness that this band has endured, I don't think anybody can disagree that they showed the best example of perseverance and dedication to their craft. They created some of the best music of all time, and even with all of their struggles, they continue to perform to the highest level and doing exactly what they love and creating the most influential music of all time. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. I had so much fun doing the research for it, and please let me know what band or artist you would like me to cover next. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and like and subscribe to let me know that you would like to see more just like this, and I hope you're having a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.